Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'm here to share with you the tarot decks that I use during the spring season. So I have a lot of decks to get through today, so we're actually going to move through them fairly quickly, but I wanted to share with you just all of the decks that to me really have a spring kind of feel to them, and decks that I tend to be drawn to use during the spring. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first one we're going to talk about real quick is the Victorian Romantic Tarot, and I do believe that this is currently out of print. This is the third edition, I believe, so it has the gold foil stamping on it. I just absolutely adore this deck. It does very much have a spring feel to me, but I use this deck year round. So that's a deck that really kind of sits out on my shelf because I tend to use it a lot for kind of heart-centric or emotionally intense readings, because I feel that this deck kind of really taps into that emotional energy, but I also feel like it doesn't it's not overly emotional, if that makes sense. So it kind of has a bit of a groundedness within that emotional energy. So that's one of the reasons why I really like to pull this deck for those type of readings, and it's one that often sits out on my shelf. Has gorgeous backs too. Of course, I haven't modded this one yet, but it has been on my list to maybe do some gold accents on the edges, but we shall see. So that is the Victorian Romantic Tarot. The next deck on my list is actually a new one to my collection, and this is the Ember Ora Tarot, and this is the Awakening edition. So I don't know exactly if this is the second edition or maybe the third. But again, this is a new deck in my collection, and I recently just completed a mod on it, which I absolutely love. I know I cut the pink gilding off, but it just really wasn't working for me, and then I kind of I modded it, or I edged it in this mauve color, and which matches the back, and I just absolutely love it. So this is a deck that, like I said, it's very new to me, and I really like the soft feminine artwork in it. It's very kind of nurturing, and it has a really wonderful, gentle energy. And I feel like it's going to be more of a spring deck. So I'm going to include it here. But like I said, this is very new to my collection. I just got it in a couple weeks ago. And so I haven't had a chance to work with it a lot. But to me, just it's the color palette and the softness and the kind of easing back into things, you know, after kind of those harsh winters and the cold weather. And this deck to me just kind of has a little bit of that spring energy where it just kind of eases you back into things. And I think it's just really pretty. And I do love the majority of the pip style cards in this deck. So that's another one that, although it's new, I think it's probably going to be very much a spring deck for me. So that is the Ember Ora Tarot. The next deck is one that I think has probably shown up on my channel before, and this is the Strider Tarot. And I really like the white space and the simplicity of this deck. It is a deck that I tend to turn to pretty much only in the spring, and I don't know if it's because it's got that kind of clear energy to it, like kind of like I said with the Ember and Ora, you know, kind of washing that all away, washing the heaviness of the winter. For me, winter is the time where I really kind of dig deep into things. I'm like in my little cave. And so this deck kind of reminds me to just kind of come back out and slowly get back out into the world. I really like the images. It's not like overly floral or anything like that, which I have a tendency to kind of lean to for my spring decks, but it has a wonderful, just kind of soft and refreshing vibe to it. But again, like the Victorian Romantic, it's not overly soft. So I really appreciate that about it. Here's the backs of it. And again, I haven't done any modifications to that deck, but it's one that's definitely, like, that's a very spring image, right? So it's definitely one that tends to come out during the spring for me. So that is the Strider Tarot. So another tarot deck that really kind of has a spring vibe to me, but one that I use year round, is the Guardian Angel Tarot cards. And I'm putting this in the tarot section because technically it is a tarot, although I do not use it that way. I use it as an oracle with just one card pulls and I read the message, but the imagery and the overall color palette and the vibe of this deck does feel very spring to me. It feels very kind of new life blooming. And I like to call this like my hug deck. This is like my grandmother hug deck. Because that tends to be the way that I use it. But I think it definitely has a wonderful spring vibe to it as well. And the messages are really fantastic, which is not something that I normally would say about a deck that has a ton of text on it, but I really kind of like them. So that's another one that has a really spring vibe. Here's the backs. And it definitely feels very spring and kind of new rebirth type of energy, but it's one that I definitely use all year round, and that's the Guardian Angel Tarot. So another deck that I use all year round is the Moonchild Tarot, but seeing as I am been kind of combining my decks into their sort of elemental, I won't say associations because these are my own personal associations for the deck. So they're kind of my personal elemental connection to the decks. So for me, this one again has a very sort of spring vibe to it because it feels like it's stepping into kind of that rebirth space, and that's kind of how I see spring. And I think that this one could go into a lot of different categories. It definitely, you know, has kind of those muted tones that maybe we see in like some kind of fall decks, or what I would consider like my fall decks. But I think overall, because of the energy of it and the way that I actually work with this deck, it feels very spring to me because it's all about kind of growing into your personal power, kind of that rebirth into that spiritual cosmic self. And it's a deck that actually, quite frankly, has surprised me at how much I do actually like it and how much I actually use it. So that is another one that definitely for me has that sort of spring rebirth. It's beautifully gilded. I know we've all seen this deck. There's the backs, but it's definitely one that I use all year round. And so it's another one that sits out on my shelf. So that is the Moonchild Tarot. And another new deck to my collection is the Spirit Song Tarot. Now, some of these decks we'll be seeing in my monthly wrap-up because some of these are, because it's, you know, getting to be springtime, these are decks that I'm actually using throughout this month and probably some into next month. And this is another one that's been a new addition to my collection. I've actually had it for quite some time, but I haven't really taken the time to dive into it because, again, it kind of felt like that spring deck. So I kind of feel like I was waiting for that spring energy to roll around and, you know, for it to maybe literally become spring as well. But this deck is actually kind of surprising me. I'm liking it a lot more than I thought I would, and I only say that because I'm generally not really big into animal decks, but this one kind of works for me. It has a very soulful energy, and this is definitely one that I am working with in the month of March, so we'll be talking about that one more in my monthly reviews. But it's just a deck that I've really enjoyed working with. It doesn't photograph well, and that's like if you are someone who likes to share your spreads on like Instagram or on video or anything, it really doesn't photograph well. It washes out, and maybe I just need to use a different background, but it's very busy and it's very light and it tends to wash out. So I don't think that the camera really does this deck justice. I think it's much prettier in person, and I'm really glad that I went ahead and got it because I went back and forth about this one for a long time. Because I really like Paulina Cassidy's artwork, but I wasn't sure about the animal energy. And to be perfectly honest, like it does usually when I see it in photos, it looks washed out. So I wasn't sure I was going to connect with it, but it's way prettier in person, I think. So that is one that, again, is new to my collection, but definitely has that spring vibe, kind of more in terms of its like the florals and the pastel colors. But I think it works probably really well all year long. So that is the Spirit Song Tarot. So another new deck in my collection that, to me, this one has a little bit of a spring/fall, which is kind of interesting. But this is the Animals Divine Tarot by Lisa Hunt. And I do want to mention that this one is out of print, and it was on my wish list, here's the backs of them, for a really long time. And it took me a long time to actually be able to get a copy of this at a decent price. So I'm not going to go too far into it, but I think it's more the fact that it has like the goddesses. And again, here we are with, this is goddesses in the majors, and then We have and the court cards as well. And then we have animals for the minor. So that's generally not something I like, but it really works for me in this deck. I love the way that the animals that she's used and the way that she's depicted them. And I don't know why I particularly feel this one is a spring deck. I don't know if it's just because it happened to get it in the spring, and so therefore maybe that's the connection I make to it. Because if you look at the color palette, it might actually be more like a fall deck. But it just kind of has that goddess energy that to me kind of taps into that spring vibe, because it's all about like stepping into your personal power. And I think that that's really kind of indicative of how my personal practice goes in relation to spring. So that is the Animals Divine Tarot. And again, this one is out of print and might be very difficult to find. So another Lisa Hunt deck in my collection that to me definitely has a spring feel is my Fairy Tale Tarot. And this is the Spanish edition because the English edition is out of print and I just won't pay the price for it. Here's the backs with the keys, which I think are really cool. This one is totally borderless, which is awesome. I do have the app on my phone, so I'm able to actually look up the cards and read the stories that go along with it, because for me, this deck is all about the stories that go along with it. And so anytime I use this deck, I always pull up the app and I look to the card and I use that story to provide my message. I also currently have this, so the app has like a little widget that you can have on like one of the screens of your phone. And so I also have this particular deck, that widget on my phone. So every day I get a card on my phone as well. And so I get to see these images every day on my phone as well. And I like to go in and read the little story that goes along for each day. So I don't really use the tarot apps to do readings, but I like to do that in the sense of having that card of the day on my phone. And particularly with this deck because it has the stories in it, and so I like to go in and read the stories. But again, the artwork, I'm a fan of Lisa Hunt's artwork, so pretty much anything she does, I'm trying to get my hands on. I'm trying to round out my Lisa Hunt collection. But that is the Fairy Tale Tarot. So another deck that I kind of put aside for spring, and this is a deck that's really actually quite new to me. It is the Luna Soul. Flip it around, Luna Soul Tarot. And this is a deck that I haven't actually read with yet. So it's kind of been sitting aside waiting for spring, because to me this deck very much has a spring vibe. I'm thinking I might trim it and get rid of these borders because you can see the back has dark gray borders, which is fine, but the front has the white ones. Anyway, this is a really cute deck. It's definitely a Rider-Waite-Smith clone. And I got it, I think, I want to say maybe fall of last year, and I've kind of been setting it aside because again it feels very much like a spring deck to me, and I think it's all the pastel colors, but it also has kind of that wonderful rebirthing energy to it that I think works really well this time of year. And it's just a really pretty deck. This one actually might be out of print at the moment, so I will have to look up and see, but that is the Luna Soul Tarot. And another deck for spring for me is my Paulina Cassidy, and this is the Paulina Tarot. And this is one that, again, it's kind of one that I do tend to use year-round a little bit, but it definitely has kind of a spring vibe, and I think it's really just all the florals and the little delicate, intricate patterns. Maybe it's a little bit this white border with these really light backs on them. I wonder if I took the white border off, if I would still feel like this is a spring deck, but it just tends to be one that I tend to go to during the spring. Although like I said, I do read with this one kind of year round as well, but I have a tendency to pull more from it in the spring. And again, I think it's just all the little delicate, intricate flowers on it. And this is one that we'll be seeing in my weekly or my monthly review as well. So I won't go too much into detail, but that is the Paulina Tarot. So the Guardian Tarot is, again, a new deck to me, although I say new, and it's really not, because it's another deck that I've had since probably fall of 2019, but I haven't worked with it yet because, again, I feel like it's kind of got that spring energy, and it's a deck that I kind of been waiting to dig into until this time of year. And it might be the color palettes, although it's a little bit of a darker, not quite so pastel. We do still have a lot of pinks and purples and greens, and to me that just kind of feels very spring. Now these little guardian tree people, I have to say that I'm a little bit unsure about the faces, but I have heard that once you read the guidebook that it just makes all the difference in the world. So I'm really looking forward to working on with this one and getting to know it a little bit better. But I think because it has that kind of spring energy to me, and that like these guardians will help you like on your new path, that kind of has that feel to me. Although, like I said, I haven't worked with this deck yet, so I don't really know how it's going to read, but it is in my spring pile because it has that kind of a feel for me. So that is the Guardian Tarot. So the Field Tarot is another deck that I do tend to use year-round, but I put it in my sort of spring collection because of the aesthetics of the deck, really. It's the color palette in this deck that makes me feel like it has kind of a spring energy to it. We have a lot of pastel colors in the pinks and the purples. I do like that we also have the dark, kind of darker purples and blues, because in spring, like, the night still comes fairly early, so that actually to me is kind of like a bridge between spring and summer type of a deck. It definitely feels like it has a little bit of both of those energies to me. And this is a deck that really I can kind of read with all year round, and I do have a tendency to pull from it despite the season, although I just have done the seasonal thing because I found that it's just easier for me to kind of handle my deck collection in that way. And I do tend to have a draw to certain decks at certain times of the year. So this is one that I do read with kind of year round, but it has more of a pull for me during the springtime. So that is the Field Tarot. So speaking of sort of transition decks in between the seasons, the Textured Tarot for me is kind of like a late winter, early spring deck. And this is a deck that I absolutely adore the imagery in this deck. I have to say, and I don't think this is the first time I've said it, and I'm probably not the first person to say it either, but the cardstock is cardboard and it's really difficult for me to work with. So that tends to kind of deter me here and there, but I absolutely adore the images. And so for me, this deck is like that transitioning from that kind of dark cave of winter into the first blossoms of spring. This is kind of what this deck is for me. It's kind of easing out of self and into the world, right? Coming out of that cave. And I think the artwork is just really, really beautiful. It's collage, which is, I always say that's not my thing, but apparently it kind of is, because I actually have quite a few collage decks now. But I just really, really like the images. I really like the messages that I get with this deck. I just really wish the creator would release another edition in some better cardstock, because this is like cardboard, super thick, and it's really difficult to work with. And here's the backs, which are really cool. So that again is kind of like that late winter, early spring deck, that kind of transitioning. So that is the Textured Tarot. So another deck that I kind of do use all year round, but really has a spring feel to me, is the Tarot of Transformation. And I think that the reason that this one has a spring feel to me is because for me, this is all about like finding your personal path and connecting with your inner self. And that's like kind of a rebirth thing, right? And so even though the imagery is maybe like, I don't know, it's maybe even a bit more summery because it has a lot of bright, bold colors, and we have a good mix of light and dark in here. It's still, because of the context of the deck, because of the subject of the deck, it feels like a spring deck to me, because it's all about rebirth and transformation. And for me, that's something that really kind of tends to happen in the spring. So I think that's why I tend to gravitate towards this deck in the springtime, is because I'm really kind of, as I've mentioned with other decks, kind of shedding the old and stepping into the new. Like the year kind of doesn't really start till the spring, right? At least I feel like it kind of doesn't. Like March is when the year really kind of starts getting going. So I think that's why I tend to pull this one in during the spring, is because it's kind of, you know, it's a deck of transformation and rebirth. And for me, that's really all about the spring. So that is the Tarot of Transformation. So one of the little pocket-sized decks that I like to use for spring is the Tarot of the Lucid Slumber. And I believe this deck, this is an indie deck, and I believe it is still available. I think I've said before that it might be out of print, but I think it is actually still available. And I just adore the artwork on this deck. It's really fun and funky, but it also has kind of a really soft and soulful vibe to it. And I just get some really powerful readings with it. And again, this is another one that kind of feels like the late winter, early spring deck. It feels kind of like transitioning out of that, you know, sort of inner cave, like I've talked about, into the exterior world. And it has extra cards in it. So there's like a handful of extra major arcana. And I actually really like the extra cards in this deck. Like here's one of them, the Door. To me, this is like the embodiment of this deck. It's like coming out of the darkness into, you know, the bright sunshine of the early spring, and things are starting to bloom. And this deck for me just really works really well in that way. And I love the artwork. I think it's really cool. Here's the backs of them, which are awesome. And it's a great little pocket size. And I think the cardstock is actually kind of fabulous. It's like the make playing cards type of cardstock, but I actually really like that. So that is the Tarot of a Lucid Slumber. So another little mini deck that has a very spring feel to me is my little Mesquite Tarot. And I do believe that this one is coming out mass market, I do believe. I think I heard that. I adore the color palette in this deck, and I adore the images. Again, it feels very like planting something new. That's what this deck feels to me. Like we're planting something new. We're getting ready to grow something. And so again, this would kind of be more of an early spring type of deck for me. And I think the color palette is fabulous. I have edged this deck in green, and here's the pretty backs. But I have to say that the cardstock, like it's slippery. And so this deck and we kind of have some issues sometimes. It likes to go flying across the room, and like there it goes again. And I don't mean like just sliding across the table. I mean, it likes to go flying across the room. So I am really actually hoping for a mass market edition, which I will probably get because I absolutely love this deck, but I have a hard time keeping it in my hand. So, you know, we have some issues. We work on it though. But I just love the artwork of it. Again, it feels like we're planting something, getting ready to plant our seeds and let things bloom. And I think that that's really beautiful. And the color palette is just so pretty. So that is the Mesquite Tarot, which I do believe the indie is out of print at this time. But like I said, I think there's a mass market coming. So another one of my favorite decks that has a very spring feel to me, but I do use year round, is the Dreaming Way Tarot. And I have trimmed my copy. And to me, this deck it's very much the embodiment of spring. It's very light. It's very fun. It has a great energy to it. And it just... yeah, it's kind of like one of those decks that just makes me happy whenever I look at it. And that kind of is how I feel about spring. Like spring just makes me happy. Okay, the allergies don't make me happy. But the coming out of the cold and the rain and all of that, and the dark and coming into the light and seeing the peaks of the sun through the clouds, you know, just really makes me happy. And that's kind of what this deck is. It's like the sun peeking out through the clouds. It's beautiful. And it's a wonderful reader. I get really clear, really wonderful readings with this deck. And so it is one that I definitely turn to all the time, year round. But it has kind of a spring energy to me. Now I have trimmed my copy, so I've taken off the sides and the top. I have edged it in green. And here's the pretty backs, which are pretty cool. So that is the Dreaming Way Tarot. So another one of my absolute favorite decks is the Antique Anatomy, and this is the mass market edition, although I do have the indie edition as well. and has the beautiful backs. And this deck is again like a more of a late winter, early spring deck for me. It again is about kind of stepping into that new growth, and particularly that new growth that kind of comes from the darkness. And that's one of the things that I really like about this deck. This deck has a really great personality. I love working with this deck. It's kind of quirky and it's a little bit on the funny side, and I really enjoy working with it. And I love the energy and the kind of blossoming of the flowers out of the kind of the darker, the gray scale images. And then you have these pops of colors. And for me, that just feels very spring, because we're like coming out of the sort of gray skies of winter into the, blue skies of spring. And so I just love that from a, kind of aesthetic point of view. As a reader, it's a fantastic reader, and I think it's probably one of my favorite decks to read with because it's got a great personality. So that is the Antique Anatomy Tarot. Now let's take a look at a couple tarots in a tin. So we have the Tarot de Maria Celia, which is my, I think this is probably my favorite Marseille deck. This deck is so cute. I love the color palette. It's the color palette that definitely gives it that spring vibe for me. All the lovely purples and pinks and greens. And it's just such a cute Marseille. I love the design of the minors. They're so pretty. And I think that, like I said, I think this is one of my favorite Marseille decks. I love that it's in a tin, so it tends to go places with me. It kind of comes and hangs out when I go places. It went to the Northwest Tarot Symposium with me, and it's just a lot of fun. And I think it has a great fun energy, and I think it's really, like I said, it's kind of the color palette that makes me pull towards it in the spring. I've edged it in multiple colors, which I know don't pick up on camera because they're very muted and they kind of match all the colors in the front and the back, but it's just a cute little deck, and I love working with it as a Marseille. So that is the Tarot de Maria Celia. So next we have the White Sage Tarot, which I think is one of my favorite tarots in a tin. I just adore this deck. This deck has a lot of different uses for me, but it definitely feels like more of a spring deck. Again, that early spring, that just first blossoming of guidance and understanding. But for me, this deck is really all about kind of taking a step back and looking at things from a very neutral perspective. This deck is very, very nurturing as well, and I love to use it as kind of a comfort type deck, but it also has a really nice, neutral, grounded energy that kind of helps you to look at things from a more from a little bit of a better perspective. So it puts a little bit of breathing space between you and your question, which I think is really important, especially when you're doing readings for a particular question or situation, which I have definitely used this deck for, but I tend to use it more of like a meditation type deck or a what I call my breather deck. Like when I just need to take a moment, I love to pull from this deck. It's just very comforting and reassuring, but it's also kind of neutral, so it doesn't really bring a whole lot of its own kind of, I don't want to say baggage, but it doesn't bring a whole lot of its own thing into the reading, so it kind of allows you some space. So I think that's really great. So that is the White Sage Tarot. So next in my spring collection is the Harmonious Tarot, and this is the mini deck. And I actually bought this deck for a particular purpose, which I'll probably go into in multiple channels. I cannot open these mini boxes. Anyway, this deck is, it's really cute. It's actually more of a pip style deck, which I wasn't aware of when I first got it. But it's, it's tiny. Like, look at this. Teeny tiny little thing. Like, it fits in my hand. It's so cute. But anyway, it just, it's really the imagery, the color palette that's really very spring about this deck. And like I said, I have a particular purpose that I'm going to be using this deck for, so I'll probably be doing that, talking about that in a different video. Definitely going to be doing a mod on it. So I'm actually going to mod a mini deck. That should be interesting. So that's another fun one that is actually new to my collection because I have plans for it. So that is the Harmonious Tarot. So the last deck that I want to share with you is the Affinia Rosa Tarot. And this deck and I actually have a complicated history. So this is the second copy of this deck I have had. I have had it before. I tried to work with it. We just weren't really getting along at that point. And so I traded it. But I really was feeling the call to kind of try to work with this deck again, and I thought about it a lot, and I finally decided to go ahead and get it, and I have a plan for this deck as well. This is a deck that I think takes a lot of time and effort, and I think that the first time I worked with it, I wasn't really willing to give it that time and effort, but it feels to me very much like a kind of that transition, early spring, kind of moving out of the winter. And again, I think it's the color palette, because whenever we have these really dark blacks with just the single pop of color, that kind of is what that feels like to me. Like we're coming out of the dark and just seeing these first hints of light. And that's kind of how this deck feels to me. Although I'm going to hold off on passing too much judgment on it at this point, because our first experience wasn't very good. But I'm feeling more like maybe we might be ready to work together now. I have a kind of, I'm going to come at it from a different approach, and hopefully that will work out better for us this time. But in terms of the decks that, decks that I tend to gravitate towards in the spring, this to me is definitely kind of a spring, late winter, early spring deck. It is like, it's a beautifully produced deck too. It's got that nice matte gilded, and it's got the lovely tea stain pages and great cardstock. Love this matte cardstock. So not too thick, not too thin. Just a beautifully produced deck. So that is the Affinia Rosa Tarot. So that was a look at the decks that are in the spring section of my collection. Now, as I mentioned, some of them are decks that I use year round, and some of them are decks that I really do only use during the spring. And I've really found that kind of sectioning my decks off into that seasonal collection really works well for me, because that's the way I tend to just utilize my practice as a whole. It tends to be very tied into the seasonal energy. And so for me, letting my decks kind of fall into those natural categories as well is very helpful for my practice. And it's really helpful for using decks that are tuning into the energy that or the phase that I'm currently in. So I would love to know what decks you use for spring, and or decks that you would consider your spring decks. So feel free to share them with me in the comments below, or go ahead and make your own video. That would be great too. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.